Welcome back to Caesar's Messiah Shredded, Part 3, Creating Christianity. Now, we've had Part 1 and 2 already, and in those we've gone through the video, Caesar's Messiah, step by step, second by second. We're going through the whole thing, and we're tearing apart every statement that's being said. For one, they've given us almost no substantiated evidence to go on, no references or citations. And then apart from that, they're just making false claims. So what we're doing is going statement by statement and calling it out. This section will be particularly related, again, more to Josephus and his writings, because that's the only historian they reference from the time period, although there were more, and how they feel that Titus and Vespasian used Josephus to perpetuate a myth that Jesus Christ... the myth of Jesus Christ, which they say is a myth. Obviously it's not, and we've shown that already through parts 1 and 2, and we'll continue to do so through part 3, through whatever it takes, because there's just no substantiated evidence for the things they're saying, and we're going to show that step by step. Now, to continue from the last video, the section we're going to see is a few seconds long, so those will run, and then I'll start in on, talking about the points. So here we go.
The Romans needed to subdue the Jews' religion, so they set about influencing it and changing it.
They realise they can't destroy the Jewish religion altogether. That's not their objective. They realise they're sensible enough to realise that they can't do that. So what you have to do is try to create a type of Judaism that is benign. And it's exactly coinciding with the rise of the Flavian dynasty is the arrival of two benign forms of Jewish ideology.
So this guy postulates at this point that at the time of 70 AD, just after the temple was destroyed by Titus and Vespasian's armies, that they created two benign forms of Jewish ideology, one being rabbinic Judaism, the other being Christianity. But again, these forms of, quote, forms of Jewish ideology, they were not created. There's zero evidence for this assertion at the time. The Jews had to naturally turn to their rabbis, which we ended up calling rabbinic Judaism, because their temple and their system of law was completely destroyed and crippled in 70 AD. Their entire belief system and religion relied on the temple, the practices in there, the priesthood, and the priesthood had been defunct for years at this point, corrupt that is, but now everything was destroyed. So of course they had to turn to their rabbis for what do we do next? How are we going to continue to practice our religion when we have no temple, no house of God? And so it was the natural outcome of this destruction. It wasn't created by anybody. In fact, we read in Josephus that Titus again and again says he didn't want to destroy the entire temple and all of the material things of it. He even gave the Jews an out, telling them that they could surrender and that he wouldn't destroy the temple and he wouldn't kill them all, that they would have a possibility of servantship. And again, it's clear throughout Josephus' record that he did this. Titus, multiple times, did not want to just wipe them out. It was almost though instead as if this whole thing was orchestrated and fated by God himself, which would have been a fulfillment of prophecy, which Christians and Jews throughout the ages have seen as a fulfillment of prophecy. But now Joseph Atwill in his video here is trying to change the whole narrative with no substantiated evidence, but with a whim, an idea. But I would guess it's even worse than that. I think it's a plan. But to continue, remember this also, that Titus and Vespasian up until this time in 70 AD had been busy with their own stuff in different places. They weren't together in some secret dark room colluding on how they were going to, from a literary standpoint, publish hundreds of different Christian writings that would all say similar things about this guy they were making up called Jesus Christ. They had their own things going on. From 57 to 59 AD, Titus was in Germania with a military tribune. He was in another part of the whole world, He then returned to Rome and was married to this family. He married a lady in this family who sought to overthrow Nero. And when he found this out, he then divorced her and rejected those notions. He didn't want to overthrow Nero. Titus didn't want any part of that. He didn't want any insurrection against the emperors. He was involved in politics at this time. And then Vespasian, on a totally different note, he had retired from his political life around 51 AD, but then re-entered it in 63 AD, before a lot of this stuff started to happen. But then he took a governorship in the African province of Rome. So he was in Africa as a governor. And while he was there, his governorship was fraught with turmoil and corruption. And even one time, when he was speaking in public, he started to get pummeled by vegetables and turnips from the public who are listening because they thought he was corrupt. And so it just wasn't, he wasn't in a secret place trying to make up these religions and figure out what to do here. And he certainly wasn't colluding with his Flavian relatives because they were all spread all over the place doing different things in politics and in wars. In 66, Vespasian was appointed to stop the Jewish rebellion by Nero. And it was not a Flavian undertaking. The Flavians weren't in power. He had simply proven himself as far as military leadership, and so he led an army. And Titus as well joined up and led an army.
It's during this period that a new literature enters history, which describes a peace-loving, turn-the-other-cheek preaching Jewish Messiah named Jesus Christ. But if the Flavians wrote the Gospels, how could a Roman family know how to write Jewish literature that refers to Jewish prophecy?
Note how they say, if they were going to create the Gospels, and in so doing they always assume, and their statements always assume, that what they're saying is right, but they still haven't given evidence for it. Just be aware of their tactics here, with the way they speak. They're not presenting ideas. They're trying to force an indoctrination. They're trying to brainwash you. Be aware.
The answer lies in the Flavians' collaborations with a number of Jewish intellectuals, beginning with their own court historian, Josephus.
Well, there's really absolutely no evidence that they had a collaboration with a number of Jewish intellectuals. If you consider Josephus a Jewish intellectual, he would be the only one we even know that they had contact with. This statement of theirs is just not documented or recorded anywhere by anyone. And the fact is that when Josephus writes in his writings about the way that the Caesars, Titus and Vespasian, the way they used him, it was only really during the war. He doesn't even say that he wrote his histories because they sanctioned it or they made him do it. They simply forced him to stay with them during the revolt, during the war against Jerusalem, and be a liaison between themselves and the Jews, because he was a Jew. That's the only thing he says that was imposed upon him by the Romans. Not that he wrote these things.
Josephus arrives back in Rome with Titus. He becomes an adopted member of the Flavian family. An amazing turn of events for the Jewish turncoat. He becomes Flavius Josephus. Josephus at this time begins writing the history of the war.
By the way, there is no writing anywhere that says that Josephus was adopted by the Romans. He doesn't claim it in any of his writings, nor do any other writings about him claim that he was adopted by the Caesars.
And he records that Titus gave him the Jewish scripture. Josephus's histories have always been associated with the origins of Christianity.
So he says Josephus at this time begins writing the history of the war. Well, his definition of at this time is apparently very, very loose, because that Wars of the Jews was not published until 75 AD. That's over 5 years after the things he was talking about. And so do they want us to believe that he spent 5 years writing this small book? Because the Wars of the Jews is not very big. It's only 7 chapters. It literally could be put into a pamphlet 30 pages long or less. So are they to make us believe that he spent 5 years working on this little pamphlet's worth of information about the war? And then they say Josephus says that Titus gave him the Jewish scriptures. And I have question marks there because I haven't found any scholar or any record of that in any of Josephus' writings, or any scholar that says that he said that, except Joseph Atwill in this video and in his book. And I just want to say that, in his book, the problem I have with it is when I see these things said, they don't give citations or references. His book has very few, actually. The preface of Josephus' Antiquities of the Jews does say that he had to translate the Hebrew scriptures into Greek, but it does not in any way allude that this was the copy of the law that came from the temple during the Jewish war, and that's what Atwill is suggesting. And since there is no evidence that the Romans destroyed Jewish literature, even though these guys will keep saying this, but there's no evidence of it, it's likely that he used one of many copies that existed at his time, and it was nothing special. There were multiple copies of the Hebrew scriptures among the Jews, and they had them. It was no big deal. And then he said, too, his quote was, Josephus' writings have always been associated with the beginnings of Christianity. Well, of course they have, because it's a vital part of the history of God's chosen race, the Jewish people. And since Jesus himself and many other Christian writers and ancient Jewish writers and prophets prophesied the destruction of Jerusalem, the history of which Josephus chronicled, then it is important for Christianity. It's part of our history. That doesn't in any way mean that it was manipulated, made up, all these things he's saying that have zero evidence.
Time and again you can find parallels between what Josephus writes and what turns up in the Gospels. It's a powerful evidence of their true origin.
No, it's not. It's not an evidence of their true origin. It's exactly the relationship I just spoke of. That Christianity and Judaism had prophesied some things, and the Christian writings came before this time period, many of them, and the things that were talked about were the things that happened in 70 AD. It just doesn't fit their narrative to say so. So they're going to skew the timeline, change the time of all the writings, and say that first was 70 AD and then was all this other stuff. So that they can then justify saying that there was no prophecy fulfilled, that instead they made up all the prophecy and then wrote books that say it was fulfilled. Which is ridiculous. It's just not the way that history went.
In reading the works of Josephus side by side with the Gospels, scholars have noticed parallels between the two works. It appears as though the history of Josephus records events that fulfill the prophecies of the Old and New Testaments. Early Christians understood this connection. In fact, when the Bible first began to be printed in the Middle Ages, it included the history of Josephus.
Yes. Christians have always thought that history is a fulfillment of prophecy. This in no way proves anything for these guys, for Atwill's postulations, and it's not evidence for that either. The New Testament books that predict the historical fulfillments that are recorded in Josephus were written up to 30 years before they occurred, and up to 50 years before Josephus' History of the Wars was published. 50 years, half a century. So to say that they came first before all that it's insane.
He was employed to write the official history that we have. The other histories from this period have been destroyed ruthlessly by the Romans.
There's just no record of the Romans destroying historical accounts of this time period at all. There are other historians of the time period we all know, those of us that read this history, we all know about and read. And I'll go over those in a minute with another slide.
Josephus tells us this in very chilling passages, how
Josephus says, by the way, in his prefaces of both the Antiquities of the Jews and the Wars of the Jews, that other histories of the time period abounded, but that he didn't approve of many of them because they spun things sometimes in a positive light for Rome. And on the other times, they would spin it for the Jews, depending on who the writer was. But he goes on to say that his intent with his writings was to record the truth for public knowledge. He does not say that any other historians were killed because the Romans didn't like their accounts of history. It's just not evidenced anywhere in the text. There is no record of that, of the Romans executing writers during history.
the Romans exerted complete control of the literature of this period. There were alternative histories of the Jewish war written. Well, the Romans rounded up the writers of those histories and executed them.
Again, there is just no evidence that that happened. I would love it if they would point it out, but they don't. They don't do it. They don't point it out in the video. They don't give citations or references in their book for this. And all the research I've done online and having read Josephus, I haven't seen evidence of that. Nor has other scholars. I've read other scholars' books that are talking about this video and this body of, quote, research, and they're like, we don't know what he's talking about. It doesn't exist.
They rounded up all the copies of those histories and destroyed them. That is to say, they ruthlessly wiped out any alternative history, so that the only history we have is written by Josephus.
Wait a second. Only by Josephus? But what about Tacitus, who lived from 56 AD to 120 AD, the same exact time period as Flavius Josephus? He referred, even in his writings of history, to Jesus' death. The whole events surrounding Jesus' death are mentioned by Tacitus in his book, The Annals, Book 15, Chapter 44. Read it yourself. Or maybe you guys forgot to read that when you were making this video. What about Suetonius, the historian? From 69 AD, the exact same time period, to 122 AD. And he even wrote about the Christians. He says punishment had been inflicted upon the Christians in Nero's time. And this is in his book called Nero 16. So what about that? You're just going to casually ignore these historians of the same time period? Do you think the Romans killed them? Because we have all their writings. What about Cassius Dio? He was, admittedly from a little later, 135 to 235 AD, but he wrote about the exact same events. His books weren't destroyed and he wasn't killed. It is nonsense to think that we don't have histories from this same time period besides Josephus. You can go out to the internet and read all these guys. They all say very similar things about what happened in the destruction of the temple. And it's just silly, the nonsense these people in this video put forward, ignoring plain, obvious truth that is known by all.
Let's remember who Josephus was.
Chief propagandist of the Flavian dynasty, and he was very, very successful. He moved back to Rome. He was given an apartment in the emperor's own townhouse, and he was appointed the chronicler of the Roman Jewish War using Vespasian's own diaries of
Chief propagandist. They say Josephus was the Romans' chief propagandist. There actually is no evidence of this. Surprise, surprise. Josephus was, by his own words, forced to witness and be with Titus Vespasian during the destruction of Jerusalem because he was used as a negotiator between the Jews and the Romans. Because he was a Jew, obviously. Had been taken captive, and they're like, this guy's good. He's convinced us he's a prophet, so we're going to use him as our negotiator between the Jews and us, so that hopefully he can help us quell the rebellion without having to destroy the city. And Titus said this again and again. He didn't want to destroy everything. Never is it said anywhere in history, in any writing, that he was a propagandist. And never is it said anywhere that the Flavians forced or sanctioned the writings that he wrote. He doesn't even claim that. In fact, he says he did it for the knowledge of the public. So where do you guys get this stuff? I don't understand. And then they say that he was using Vespasian's own diaries of the events while he wrote. But there, again, is no evidence of this that I could find anywhere in the writings of Josephus.
The events.
Also in the pages of his history, Josephus declares that the Jews' Messiah or Christ is none other than Flavius Vespasian and his dynastic family.
Now, this is actually slightly correct. And I want you to read this. Josephus did claim that he thought that one of the prophecies of the Jews' fulfillment was Vespasian himself. And here it is. It's Josephus, Wars of the Jews, book 6, chapter 5, verse 4. He says, "But now, what did the most elevate them in understanding this war was an ambiguous oracle that was also found in their sacred writings, how about that time one from their country should become governor of the habitable earth. The Jews took this prediction to belong to themselves in particular, and many of the wise men were thereby deceived in their determination. Now, this oracle certainly denoted the government of Vespasian, who was appointed emperor in Judea." And so in this we see Josephus says, I think that the Jews were wrong. It wasn't going to be one of their own, but that this governor of the habitable earth in the prophecies was going to be Vespasian. Notice that he did not say that this was the Jewish Messiah, nor did he say that this was Titus, which would have made sense because this whole video series on Caesar's Messiah, the whole book, says that they wanted to push the narrative of Titus as the Messiah. But yet here's Josephus claiming something totally different, that it was Vespasian he thought was, and he doesn't even say he was Messiah. He says, I think that he is a fulfillment of one of their prophecies, the one about the governor who was going to govern the inhabitable earth. And so he mentions this, but he does not claim he was the Messiah. So everything about what the Atwill and the makers of the video are claiming is not stated at all in Josephus. It's just not there.
To put it succinctly, Josephus says that there was a prophecy that a world ruler would come out of Palestine. The Jews thought this applied to one of their own. They were wrong in their interpretations. He used the most cynical interpretation. He applied it to the rise of the Roman emperor in Palestine.
Josephus recorded that the Messianic prophecies foresaw not a Jew, but Vespasian and his dynasty. In fact, all of the Flavian historians recorded that the Flavian Caesar was the Christ.
So he says, in fact, all the Flavian historians recorded that the Flavian Caesar was the Christ. Well, since there is only one Flavian historian that we know of, Josephus, and he did not say that anyone was the Christ or a Messiah. He just said that this was a governor, a ruler. The statement that Atwill makes there is complete nonsense. It's not substantiated anywhere. He just keeps conflating it into something that he wants it to be. And by restating it again and again, you have the dramatic music that's tying everything together. You have these other supposed authoritative scholars. These guys aren't authoritative, let me just tell you. But he's trying to just build something in your mind that's bigger and more right than it ever could be.
It was important to the Flavians that they be seen as the Christ, as divine and godlike, and this was not mere vanity. The Julio-Claudians before them had already established that presenting themselves as gods was a powerful tool in controlling their subjects.
Well, this is interesting because almost all of the Roman emperors from the time of Julius Caesar in 42 BC had claimed to be divine or a god. All of them. This isn't something special that, Titus came along and claimed to be a god or Vespasian. No, they all did. And they all required their subjects to bow in allegiance to them, to, quote, worship them as such. And they didn't even force them to say they were the only God, but just to admit that they were God, like they were divine, and then bow to them. Then they were allowed to do business, etc., etc. But none of these emperors, none of them throughout all of history claimed to be the Jewish Messiah. Zero. Absolutely none. They just didn't do it. And that is where we're going to stop today. This was a shorter one, but sometimes I base these sections on how long it takes me to get the research out. There's a ton of research and looking and searching that goes into, verifying that these claims are spurious. And like, where did they get that? Because they don't give you references. They give you so few references and citations in their book that you just don't know where they're getting it. And they're making it all up. And if they do find something related they can base it on, they're then twisting it and changing it to suit their own viewpoints, their little narrative here about that skews time and changes history. So don't be duped by this. We're going to keep going through this video in part 4. So like and subscribe on the channel so you get notifications when it comes out. Thank you for joining us. Bye-bye.